So welcome to session 5 of our series on Jesus in Matthew. And today we're looking at 2 encounters, Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus and the Canaanite woman, and his disciples are involved in both of those encounters as well. So as I mentioned, we've got 2 encounters involving Jesus and his disciples, first with the Pharisees, who question the practice of the disciples. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders, for they do not wash their hands before they eat? And the second encounter with a Canaanite woman whose daughter is tormented by a demon, who pleads with Jesus for healing, and the disciples intervene, seeking to send her away. We're going to propose in this study that in both encounters, Jesus is operating very much as we would expect a Jewish rabbi to operate, in how he debates with the Pharisees and then how he interacts, at least initially, with this foreign woman. So we begin by remembering the instruction, wash your hands, and sing happy birthday while you're doing it. Remember that. Well, the Pharisees of old didn't have the happy birthday song to guide the advice of washing hands, but we need to think a little bit about why they were so worried about washing hands. We know that they devoted their lives to teaching and explaining each of the 613 commandments and ordinances within the book of Torah. They actually added them up and noted there were 248 commandments telling you what you must do, but there were 365 commandments telling you that what you must not do in Scripture. And washing hands before eating was a part of life in the ancient world, but we need to think about why. When you look at the comparison that we have in the resource material between Matthew and Mark, you see that Matthew leaves out a chunk of explanatory material that Mark includes. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands. They observe the tradition of the elders. They do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. Now, Matthew admits all of this, and there's no clear reason why, but Elizabeth and I come down on the side of perhaps Matthew knows his Jewish audience would already know this, so he doesn't need to explain it. So he removes that and gets on to other things. So a bunch of questions relating to how do you wash your hands? How much water? What vessel do you use to pour it? Remembering that you didn't have piped in tap water in the ancient world in your house. How much of each hand do you wash? What kind of water is acceptable? What is not acceptable? Who has to perform this? Is everyone required to do it or only some? What makes the hand washing ineffective? And more questions. And these are not questions that I've just made up. These are actually questions that are addressed in a document that I'm going to explain to you now. You would have heard of the Mishnah. We've mentioned it before. Mishnah is an Aramaic word that means repetition. And so what we have in the Mishnah, which is a document written in the early 3rd century, what we have in the Mishnah is a repetition of a collection of the various 613 laws found in Hebrew scripture as they are discussed and debated by the Pharisees. So how do we understand this particular law? How do we understand that particular law? For my sins many years ago, decades ago, last millennium, I started out my studies doing law. And one of the things we had to do was do case law. And you open these great ancient volumes full of tiny print, and you read what Judge so-and-so said in such and such a case. And then you skip forward 5 years and read what Justice so-and-so said in a case that appealed using that, and so on. And case law in our structure is built on this very basis of one learned legal person interpreting the situation before them, and then later on that being used as a precedent in another case, and then later on in another case, and so on and so on. And so it builds. Well, that's all that the Pharisees were doing, They were repeating the law and discussing what was required. So there on your screen, and also in your resource, you have the 6 orders of the Mishnah. The orders are like the chapters or the major sections, or the volumes actually. Seeds, festivals, women, damages, holies, and purities. And within each of those orders or sections, there are various tractates. So in Tractate to Horet, the 6 of the 6 orders, which has to do with purities, one of them is called Yadayim, which has to do with hands. And that's a whole section of the Mishnah devoted to this very question. How do you ensure that your hands are appropriately washed before you eat or do other important things? And we need also to remember that viruses and germs and all of that was not in the minds of the ancient world, that the process of washing your hands was a process of making clean in terms of holiness, not in terms of hygiene. So all of this is about being clean before God and being in a right state when you share a meal. Does anyone have any questions about the Mishnah and what I've said about it thus far? All righty.
John, thank you,
yes.
John. I just get your last sentence, that this is not about hand hygiene, but it's about holiness. So the
Yes.
idea of James and virus were not there at the beginning.
That's right, yeah.
And it's an interesting historical thing because I used to teach medieval history, and you wonder how the Jews managed in a time where things weren't extremely clean, where cleanliness wasn't even part of like the conversation. And you wonder if the Jews maintained that regime when everyone else around them wasn't bathing and washing hands and food.
I don't know that's exactly correct, Carolyn, because the Romans were very clean. They set up bathhouses and washing things everywhere, but nobody knew about germs. Somebody may have worked out that if you go around with filthy hands, you get sick a lot, and if you wash them, you don't. Someone may have made connections like that, but there's nothing to suggest that except covertly or indirectly.
Well, it's interesting when you look at medieval history. I've been to Ephesus, and, they had all those things you talked about in that Roman city, pumped water, sanitary things. But then you go into a medieval society and we actually lost that knowledge. We seem to lose that, and I wonder if the Jews kept it during that time.
I would imagine so, because it became, if it's not in their law, as John explains in the stuff here, but it's part of their practice.
Yeah.
So by default, they probably managed to keep themselves alive longer during things like plagues and, spreading of nasty viruses and bacteria.
But I'm just looking at it historically. I thought it's interesting a group can keep themselves alive doing that.
And they're a minority group. They've always been a minority group
Yes.
wherever they've
Yep.
lived. And so this is one amongst a number of things that they do just to protect their society, I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah.
But it's interesting. I've always found with the Jews how they survive all these horrible calamities and keep their traditions intact.
Yes, they've certainly got staying power and resilience.
Yes. Yep.
If washing hands was standard practice, and as you said earlier, John, it was the rule, why then were the disciples who were good Jews, why weren't they doing it?
Well, there actually is no commandment in Hebrew scripture to wash your hands before you eat. So they're not breaking any law, but as we've put into the resource material here, there are ways and means to get to a certain end. So whilst there's no instruction to wash your hands before you eat, there are instructions that a person with a discharge should wash their hands, that when you sacrifice a heifer, when you're trying to gain some insight into an unsolved murder, that you wash your hands. But particularly, but perhaps the most pertinent one is that the priest should wash their hands and feet with water, from the bronze basin in the temple or the tabernacle before they approach the altar of sacrifice. So that's preparing yourself to be in a clean state before God, a holy state before God, before you undertake a holy action. But we do know that beyond Hebrew scripture, this practice of washing hands before praying had come into being. A letter of Aristeas, which is the letter that tells us about the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, said that before they started the process of translating, the 72 translators, following the custom of all the Jews, washed their hands in the sea in the course of their prayer to God. So they went down to the water, washed their hands, prayed to God, and then set about making the translation. And then there's this document, it's called the Sibylline Oracles, but it's actually a Jewish document. It says, at dawn, the Jews lift up their holy arms toward heaven from their beds, always sanctifying their flesh with water. So between the time that Hebrew scriptures are written and the time of the New Testament, a practice had arose, which presumably comes by analogy from what the priests did in the holy place before. And that's...
I think here, Matthew, if the Pharisees are doing some tradition, Matthew is just as likely to oppose it as not, if it's not the law.
No.
So, he may just be being contrary here by his or it could be a pragmatic thing that these are itinerant people wandering around and they may not have water to spare for washing hands. Matthew knows it's a tradition because both Mark and Matthew talk about the tradition of the elders, not the law. So it can be broken. Yeah.
So the tradition of the elders is the oral discussion that eventually gets written down in the Mishnah, as opposed to the law of the Lord, which are the commandments that are written in the 5 books of Moses. So there's that distinction also in the passage, yeah.
And that's what the Sadducees would follow, isn't it? Just what's in the law, not what's in the traditions of the Pharisees.
That's right. Yes. So the Sadducees just have those 5 books. The Pharisees accept those 5 books and the prophets and some of the writings and the oral tradition. And the Sadducees are involved in the oral tradition. The Sadducees debate the Pharisees about various laws, but they don't consider that debate is part of the Torah, whereas the Pharisees do. It's a complicated matter.
And Sadducees would have shared some practices because the priests shared those practices, such as washing hands.
Yeah,
it would be highly unlikely the Sadducees wouldn't wash hands because the priests do.
Yeah.
John, can I just make an unimportant point, probably, is that in the 20th and 21st centuries, we discovered that copper can be poisonous if you drink the hot water that comes through the copper pipes, etc. It can make you quite ill. But it would be the same sort of thing if these ancient people used bronze all the time. Wouldn't there be some infiltration of sickness?
Highly likely.
Out left.
Are you sure
Probably,
that's copper
because
or
with the
lead?
Romans that happened. The Romans had lead pipes everywhere, and it did affect them eventually.
Yeah.
Right.
But they didn't know that at the time. They just thought it was an inert metal.
No.
That was easily valuable to some useful purpose.
Our water supplies come through copper pipes. I know the problem has been with lead, not with copper.
Right.
Yeah, and there's certainly a lot of problems with lead, which leaches in.
But there's also problems with copper, because there was a case of a doctor in Newcastle at Royal Newcastle Hospital in the good old days, and he used to have his morning coffee, and he'd use the hot water out of the copper pipes, and he became quite ill. And that's how they discovered that this wasn't good for one.
Yeah, I doubt if the ancient people knew this. They may eventually draw some connections, but I don't know that it was drawn at the time. They're not quite that clever.
Okay, we're going to give you a bit of time just to toss around this question in your group. If we set the debate of Matthew 15 into this context, how does it help us to interpret this particular passage?
Well, how did you go with those questions? About, is it helpful knowing this sort of information to put this passage in context?
Definitely.
Definitely, Enid? Do you want to say anything more than definitely?
Oh, well, just the simple fact that we just have accepted the teachings over the readings over the years, Elizabeth, and when you read it and understand the depth of it and why it's been written the way it is, it does make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
And comparing the different readings from Mark and Matthew and so on, and leaving out.
Yep, that's a good point. Thanks, Enid. That it does help us understand a little bit better what this debate is about. Any other comments from your groups?
The fact that Mark has to put in brackets all the stuff about what the Jewish tradition was indicates he's writing to a different audience, doesn't he?
It does, Derek. It does suggest there are people in there that don't understand Jewish law and Jewish practice. So Mark needs a big editorial comment to explain it.
Interesting here, our Catholic brethren, when they enter the church, you know, they put their hand in the holy water and they make the sign of the cross. And I guess we could interpret that as being wishing to enter the church in what they call a state of grace, a condition of ritual purity for the ceremonies and the service that's to follow. I often think that when we had the Protestant Reformation, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. We got rid of a lot of those practices, which to me have some significance.
I'd agree with that, Ian. I think that when we reduced it to sola scriptura and, you know, grace without much going with it, with Luther, we did lose a lot of things that make meaningful gestures, that are a thing that you do that actually reinforces in your mind and in your heart that you're entering a holy space or you're doing something holy. The closest we have, I think, as a remnant is saying grace before our meals.
But it's also the fact that whether the ritual has something inherent in it, or have something of value inherent in it, or whether the ritual is actually meant to point you to something spiritual. Because I mean, that's verse 8 and 9, where it says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me."
Yeah.
They teach human precepts as doctrine. So, it doesn't matter. You have heard it said, it doesn't matter what you are as a person as long as you go to church.
Yes. I certainly don't think Matthew's advocating that.
No.
No, I don't think Matthew is, but I think there is that human side of it, that it's more important to follow the rituals than to be a person whose hearts are with God.
Yeah. I think if a ritual, I mean, it could be inherent. I'd probably have some questions about that. Or even if it just points to something greater, if you follow where it's pointing, then it's got to have, one would hope, a beneficial effect on you, or be a beneficial thing for you to do if it turns your thoughts and your ways towards something that might be considered holy or just, or whatever it is that you're doing. But rituals also can be, as you point out, you do it and therefore you're okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just always think of the stories of the Italian mafia bosses with their priests,
Yes, that's right. And don't think Italian mafia bosses don't believe in their Catholic faith. They do.
Yeah.
I'm
They
not saying
absolutely
that,
do.
but their faith is interpreted as that I can carry on doing all the mafia things, killing people and stuff, but I've got a faith in the priest and what he says, so that's okay.
That's because I can confess my sins and he'll absolve me and I'll be good. That's right.
Yeah.
I think that is really taking the whole concept of what confession is about and twisting it somewhat. If you do that, because the idea is go and don't sin again.
Isn't that what Matthew is talking here about in chapter 15 in that verses 1 to 9?
He may well be, when he said that, if you just follow something and it doesn't mean anything, what's the point?
Yeah. Isn't there somewhere in Torah about the important circumcision of the heart that's important?
I would tell you that circumcision of the flesh is just as important in Torah.
Yeah, but that's the prophetic line of interpretation, Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, right? Yeah.
Can I intervene with a note of maybe heresy? A Catholic friend of mine once told me that to make holy water, they boil a kettle and boil it and boil it and boil the hell out of it, and then you've got holy water.
Oh dear. Right. Thanks, Derek.
I don't know if that's true or not, Derek. I thought they just said special blessings over it and that made it holy.
So what we're going to ask you to do now is to dig down into this passage by doing a characteristic Squires Reign comparison between Mark and Matthew. That's the beginning of it that you have up there. So we're going to put you into groups and ask you to consider the similarities in the story and then notice the differences that Matthew makes as he reports Mark. You've got the whole 20 verses of Matthew and 23 verses of Mark on page 3 of your resources. And also, as you're doing that, you might like to think about how the debate goes. Last week, we looked at how Jesus uses typical rabbinic style argumentation. And here he's arguing, he's debating with the Pharisees. And so he's doing it on their own terms, in their own way. He is quoting scripture to refute their views. And there's a couple of different scripture passages that you might notice in this debate, some of which seem more relevant and some less relevant for the issue of washing hands. And he also comes to the conclusion that it is the things that come out of a person's mouth that come from the heart that defiles that person. Out of the heart comes all these evil things. So it's about what we internalize and what therefore inside of us shapes the way that we live. So he's not saying these laws, these debates are bad, are wrong, but he's saying what we do with them, whether we internalize them or whether we let other things colonize our insides, our heart, and take over the way that we operate. That's the important thing. So one set of questions is to compare the two accounts, noticing similarities and differences, and seeing what changes Matthew makes and pondering why. The other set of questions, we're going to give you a lot of time in the group, and you can deal with this question as well. What typical methods of rabbinic style debate can you notice? And from that, and we might talk about this when we come back together in the one group, do you agree that in this story, Jesus is not abolishing the law, but showing how to fulfill the law? So it's a complicated set of questions, sorry about that, for this passage, which is a fairly complicated passage.
How did you go?
Well, one thing I noticed as we were going along, to me, there seems to be a high degree of correspondence between those two passages in Mark 7 and Matthew 15. The differences are a bit hard to detect.
Are they in the same order?
No.
No, they're not. So there's one difference straight away. Matthew has reversed the order of Mark with some things. Does Matthew have extra material?
No.
Oh, he does.
Are you sure about that?
Does.
Yes, he
No,
does.
He does.
Talks about the blind leading the blind.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, that's completely out of Mark, isn't it?
Matthew says the disciples said to Jesus, "Don't you know that you've offended the Pharisees?" Mark doesn't say that.
Because he probably doesn't have to worry about that with his own congregation.
Well, this is correct. What about things like Corban and offerings and that? Is that in Mark?
Yes. That is in Mark.
It's written differently.
11, verse 11.
Yeah, different order.
Different order.
And it was obvious that Mark wasn't writing to a Jewish audience.
Yes.
What
about
Matthew, pardon?
What about the rest of verse 11 in Matthew? I'm going to push this point. Is that in Mark?
In Mark, it's different because he's saying it. I mean, virtually says it doesn't matter what you eat. And I don't know if the declaring all foods clean is actually original or whether it's been added in a bit later from the original Mark. It looks like one of these added in passages like the end of Matthew.
Well, it's a narrative statement. It's is it in Matthew?
No, it's not, because Matthew just says it's
John the
not what
doorbell.
you eat, but it can presume that they're still following kosher rules.
Yeah. And when Matthew says, whatever support you might have had from me is Corban, that is an offering to God. Is that in Mark?
Corban, yeah.
That's what I was getting at in verse 11. Is that in Mark?
No.
No, it's not.
Sorry, in Mark, that's Mark verse 11.
Hang on, one at a time. I cannot hear you all at once. John, then Carolyn.
But that's Mark 7 verse 11, talking about what is Corban, isn't it? So are you saying that's not in Matthew? I missed that.
Matthew doesn't, Mark doesn't say about an offering from God is korban.
No, so that's interesting because Matthew just says honor your father and mother.
Mark just has.
I know, but whatever support you might have had from me is given to God. So
Matthew's extended it, hasn't he?
yeah.
Okay, Caroline, what were you going to say?
No, it was virtually the same thing as what John said. The difference, well, for me, Matthew assumes his audience knows what he's talking about.
Yes, he does. He does make that assumption.
Whereas Mark assumes that he's got to explain things.
Yeah. And Matthew's giving you some extra Jewish detail. Like whatever support you might have had from me is korban, that an offering to God.
Mm.
But both those chapters come to the same point in the end. And it becomes an argument about what's in the heart and evil intentions, and then there's a whole catalogue of sins and bad behaviours, theft, false witness, slander, fornication, murder, adultery, and so on. So they both end up at the same point.
They do end at the same point, but Matthew comes about it in a slightly different way from Mark. And you'll notice that when Mark says things like, by this he declared all foods clean, there's no way that's surviving in Matthew.
Mm.
No.
That would be very anti-law to say that, so off with its head. Matthew just removes it.
It really stands out, doesn't it? The difference between the audience when you read them side by side.
That's probably the big point we have here, that the two audiences for these writers of these Gospels are actually quite different, aren't they?
Yeah.
So they do come to the same point, but they take a slightly deviated route to suit who they're talking to.
And if we understand it properly, Mark is well, his is obviously secondhand. He wasn't there. He's getting his account from Peter, who by this time is 60 years old, and so on. His memory and Matthew's memory aren't going to be the same.
Well, we
if they were
don't know
completely
that.
the same, we'd suspect it, wouldn't we?
We don't know that, Derek. We have no idea who wrote these. Tradition says that Mark got it from Peter. Tradition says that it was Matthew, the tax collector, but we really don't know who wrote them.
And that's really on the idea that these are just differently remembered historical accounts, whereas in fact, it misses that these are in fact theological constructs.
Yes. Yeah, they're written, while they come to the same point, there's some important seeding things along the way, like Mark saying, by this he says all foods are clean. You know, Matthew just takes that out because that's not appropriate for his community, but it is for Mark's. So it seems a little thing, but it tells us a lot about who was there, doesn't it?
Well, who made up the majority of the group of people that were listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And
I mean, there may well have been Jews there in in Mark's community, but there was also an awful lot of Gentiles.
Yeah. And I'd imagine those early men and women of God in the church trying to figure out what was from Jesus and what was just a tradition they were doing, what related to, what part of the Jewish laws and tradition did they need to keep? I'd imagine that's a fairly large amount of the conversations.
Well, we know it was a live debate from Paul's letter to Galatia, because Paul absolutely excoriates Peter for not eating with Gentiles after people come from James. Peter withdraws, probably because the people from James who are following Jewish law say to Peter, what do you think you're doing? And Paul has a real go at him about that. Interestingly, Paul does not have a go at James, where the orders presumably came from. He attacks Peter, which tells you something about James and his power. But that's another thing. But we know it's a live debate from this.
So speaking of Gentiles, we need to make a trip into Gentile territory, or almost into Gentile territory.
Yeah.
Canaanite woman, Tyre and Sidon.
So she's a Canaanite woman in Matthew. She's a Syrophoenician woman in the Gospel of Mark. So we need to think about why Matthew might have changed that. And this is like the passage we just read. The story is clearly the same story. But I'm going to venture to suggest that there's some there's small changes, but they're very significant ones that Matthew makes to his Markan source. And again, we find in here with this story, we have another prohibition about Jesus only going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So in the story, Jesus has gone up to the district of Tyre and Sidon, but I would put the argument, looking at the Greek, he actually doesn't cross into it. He seems to be, because the woman who comes, this Canaanite woman, it says she comes out of the borders when you look at the Greek. I've spent a lot of time with this, and a lot of time I was arguing with my PhD supervisor about this. So he appears to be on his way there, and she comes out of those borders and she cries out to Jesus, as she does in Mark, to heal her daughter. But there's some very unique things about how she addresses Jesus, how Jesus responds to her. They're not in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus initially rejects her, and then he's acting in a very Jewish kind of way by doing this, about fulfilling scriptures where the Messiah is sent to God's chosen people, that is Israel. But she gets the better of him in the argument, and you'll notice Matthew adds some words in here and takes some words out of Mark and adds some others in that you might want to attend to. And then the punchline in Mark is, for your saying you may go, your clever saying, I will heal your daughter. But in Matthew, it's for your faith, I will heal your daughter. So there's some interesting things that are different. So what we want you to do is, in this section, we want to take a goodly amount of time for you to compare these two accounts. And I want you to look for these differences and similarities. Don't just gloss over the text. You'll need to look at it, because sometimes it's just a word that Matthew has changed or removed, but it alters significantly what he's saying. And we've put some questions in your handouts to help you. Where is Jesus in Mark and Matthew? What does Matthew change about Mark, about where Jesus is? How is the woman described? How is Jesus responding? What are the disciples doing? It's a different role in each story. How is Jesus understanding his mission? Where do you think the mission and the woman fit together? What is the turning point, and how does Jesus close the story? So we want you to think about all of those things in your group. Is there any questions that you have?
It's only one thing that I've come across in the last few years, is people saying that in this story, the woman teaches Jesus about his mission and sort of and Jesus has had it wrong up to then, and I just find that probably inconsistent with the Christologies of both Mark and Matthew. Have you got any comment on that?
You might be referring to James McGrath's book, What Jesus Learnt from Women. He certainly has a big chapter on this particular woman. I think he concentrates more on the Markan woman than he does on the Matthean version. But I think it is a turning point, especially in some ways for Jesus, because he's not very nice to this woman. We have to just take our lumps and accept that he isn't. He's downright rude, but she changes his mind. And that therefore has implications that it may change his outlook on what his mission is. But we're not going to talk about that anymore now. That is for your group. So you can talk about it there. Because I think Jesus does change his mind. So if you've been taught Jesus doesn't change his mind, I'm going to suggest to you that's not a good thing.
Well, I'm saying, well, I don't know what Jesus actually did, but because the Mark and Jesus is, you know, the Christologies of Mark and Matthew, I think, are different anyway.
Well,
So
that's true, but in both versions, he changes his mind. But I'm going to put you in your rooms now and you can chat about it there. What differences did you spot that Matthew has changed, and why do you think he's made them?
Well, the approach of the two women is different, isn't it? In the Mark story, the woman prostrates herself, but in the Matthew story, initially the woman comes and abuses him, and it's only later on that she says, "Perhaps I've got through to this fellow. I'll get down on my knees."
In the Matthew version, he emphasizes the faith. Great is your faith.
Yes, he does.
Which is, of course, something that Paul later takes up. And whereas in the Mark version, does he use the word faith? He doesn't use the word faith. So faith is an issue here in Matthew.
Yes, it is an issue in Matthew. His punchline's different because Jesus says to Mark, for that saying, and he's complimenting her on how clever it is, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. Where Matthew is not having any of that. It's all about the faith of the woman at the end. What about the beginning? What does he do in Mark that he doesn't do in Matthew in verse 24?
Goes to the region of Tyre, or you said to the district of Tyre and Sidon. I'm not sure why Sidon has been added in.
What does Mark say?
He set out.
No, it says that he
entered a house.
He goes into the house.
Yeah.
Yes,
Jesus
that's not
goes
in
into the
Matthew.
house.
That's Matthew's Jesus is not going into any Gentile house. Thank you very much. So that is removed completely.
All right, yeah, that's a good point.
Yes, and the woman in Matthew is a lot more aggressive about what she does.
Now, just a second. We're not going to call this woman aggressive.
Oh, sorry.
This woman is assertive.
Sorry, assertive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, she's also seems desperate.
She is desperate.
Yes.
But what is the difference? I mean, Piers has noted that the Syrophoenician bows down. What does the Canaanite woman do? And we've got direct speech here. We've got reported speech in Mark, but she has a direct speech in Matthew. What does she say to him?
She shouts.
She does, but what does she say? What does she shout?
Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by prison. Now, you think it'd be interesting that a Gentile person would be referring to a son of David?
Quite. And she uses the title Lord, Adonai in the Hebrew.
In group 3, we had some discussion over whether the woman is telling Jesus what his ministry should be. He has this restrictive view that he's there for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and what she's effectively saying to him is, no, mate, your mission is wider than that. There are us Gentiles too, and if we have faith in you, you've got an obligation to us.
Is that what she's saying in Matthew? She's certainly saying something similar in Mark, and Jesus' response indicates that. But is she saying that in Matthew? Why is she a Canaanite? Why has Matthew changed Syrophoenician, do you think?
Were they less liked?
Think of your Jewish history. Who was in the land before the Jews came?
The Canaanite.
Was
The
Canaanite.
Canaanites were.
Yes. Yep.
They were the original people of the land. Did the Jews intermarry with the Canaanites and take them as slaves?
Yeah.
Yes,
In
they
tradition.
did. They absolutely did. So Canaanites have a slightly different standing from your average Greek Gentile.
Okay.
Matthew has a disciple who's Simon the Canaanite. So he obviously considers Canaanites, if not quite Jews, they're a step above Gentiles, I'm thinking.
All right.
So he's
In the
got a
pecking
slightly
order.
different, because she knows the language of the Jews. She calls him
Yes.
Lord and Son of David, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go down a little bit further. So we got this prohibition again from Jesus. He says, like a good Jewish Messiah, I'm only sent to Israel, so nick off. And then she kneels down and says, Lord, help me. And now look at the two statements here in Matthew and Mark. In Matthew, Jesus says, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. What does he say in Mark?
Just
Let the children be fed first.
Yes, let the children be fed first. Now, there's an indication there that there's going to be a second feeding if there's a first feeding. So let Israel be fed first, then it's probably going to go to the Gentiles. But in Matthew, he alters that. He takes that, let the children be fed first. He takes it right out and just says it is not fair to take children's food and throw it to the dogs.
Which
And
puts
then
a completely different spin on it.
It does put a different spin, especially her response. What's the difference between the Canaanite woman and the Syrophoenician woman's response to that statement by Jesus?
Well,
there is a response. What does Matthew add?
It's the
Master's table.
Yes, the master's table. Matthew adds that in, which reinforces her status as a Canaanite. So even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. That's not in Mark. So Mark has removed, let the children, Matthew's removed, let the children be fed first, and he's added in their master's table. They're small changes, but they're highly significant.
And in Mark, the children are fed first in the feeding of the 5,000, and then the Gentiles are fed later in the feeding of the 4,000, which comes after this.
Yes, so Matthew alters that. His feeding, the second feeding, isn't really Gentile, I don't think, because he changes the geography.
Yeah, yeah, see that.
So Matthew is not buying into this children fed first and then we'll have a Gentile mission stuff. He's not keen on that, and he's not keen on rewarding anyone for their clever saying, but he does reward someone for their faith. And she's shown that. She believes who he is. She calls him Lord, Son of David. That's a messianic title. She knows who he is, and that's why she's come out to seek his help. And she acknowledges that she is getting crumbs from a master's table where the Syrophoenician woman doesn't. So any other questions or comments you want to make? Small changes perhaps, but very significant. Look at those titles she uses. Look at the way she responds and what Jesus says to her. It's the same story, but Matthew has really made it an exclusionary kind of story that she batters her way through. One, because she understands Jewish stuff. And secondly, she shows faith in Jesus as a Messiah.
It's interesting that some of our hymns talk about sort of Son of David and stuff, as though that's a big thing for us, whereas really it's sort of incidental, because we're not actually our expectations don't really concern about being him being a son of David or a new king like David.
Well, it's son of David isn't about being a new king. It's a messianic title.
Yes, I know. Well, that may be the case, but how do we understand that as a messianic title? It's not. Is it really an important messianic title for the church today?
Well, it might be for some people and not for others. It was certainly important in the first century.
Yeah, well, I agree.
It's just like we've lost titles of Jesus. We do refer to him sometimes as Son of David. We rarely refer to him as Son of Man, and that's his favourite title for himself.
Yeah, and that's what that means is confusion too. Whether it just means it's a self-reference.
Well, it is a self-reference, but it's not. It doesn't just mean he's human. If that's what you're getting at, it doesn't. No matter what progressives might say about that, it actually has an apocalyptic, eschatological meaning attached to it too, because he always judges as the Son of Man on the last day.
All right.
So it has other implications about it. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, I take my hat off to the lady. She knew who she was talking to. She was pretty sure that he could do what she asked him to do. I take my hat off to her. You know.
Yeah, well said, Derek. Because this woman is not being aggressive. She's assertive. She's desperate, and she really chases after Jesus because she's so sure that he can do what she wants to do. So we should be, as Derek says, taking our hat off to this lady.
Yeah.
Well, is she then seen as a model of how we should be?
Well, she's certainly a model of how I probably conduct my ministry. You just ask my congregation.
I mean, she's on a par with the woman at the well, in a sense.
Yeah.
Anyway,
but her knowledge is far greater, and her understanding is far greater as a Canaanite than Mark's Syrophoenician woman, and I think that's why Matthew has made the change.
But that's a general thing in Mark, isn't it?
Sorry?
Well, I mean, it's in the context of Mark where the disciples don't ever really understand until the end. And so apart from demons knowing who Jesus is, the disciples never really understand, and before the crucifixion, certainly, what's going on.
There is that in Mark, but I'm looking at why Matthew's changed it, not what Mark is saying. If you understand the distinction.
Well, yeah, I understand that bit. I just kept referring back to what you said about what happened in Mark.
Yeah, I think in Mark, this is a Gentile woman. She's heard of Jesus' fame. She outbests him in an argument. And in both cases, the woman changes his mind. No matter what you might have been talking about, the immutable, unchangeable nature of Jesus. We have an incident.
I never said that. That's putting words into my mouth.
An incident here that shows
I'm talking
Jesus,
about the Christologies that are presented by Matthew and Mark.
Well, the Christology by Matthew and Mark includes Jesus having the potential to change his mind because he does.
And there were points in the Old Testament where God changed his mind too. Like
God changed his mind at least half a dozen times that I know of in the Old Testament. My favourite is in Deuteronomy 32. And God repented of the evil he was about to do to his people.
I quote that one too.
But there are others. It's not the only one.
Well, Abraham.
Yes, so God says he'll change his mind if Abraham can stump up some righteous people in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yes.
And there were times when, like Moses was forced to hold his hands up to keep
if you read Numbers 11, which is probably the most horrifying chapter in the entire Torah, you'll find Moses has a great dummy spit at God and says, they're your flock, I'm sick of them, you look after them. And there's this toing and froing that goes on between them. And, you know, the end result is not pleasant, but God does take control and God does change some things. He does, as does Moses. So God does change God's mind in the Bible. And here we have Jesus changing Jesus' mind in the New Testament.
Well, God's very tolerant, isn't he? Thank goodness.
Yes.
Well, I don't think he's very tolerant in numbers, Derek. That's why I said it's a rather horrifying chapter. He's not tolerant at all. Anyway, we've come to the end of our time. So thank you, everyone, for a very good discussion and for entering into it. And I'm hoping you're seeing how much information we can actually glean when we have a look at things side by side and we look at how Matthew changes his source material. It's actually quite profound in a number of ways. And we're going to enter deep into that next week when we look at Peter's confession about Jesus and the ecclesia. What does that really mean? If you'd like to do any homework, you can have a look at Matthew 16 and read that chapter for homework. So you're prepared when John's notes come out and when we have our session next week.